Hey fellows, Luggo here. Before we get started on the topic, I've gotta go get myself some gamer juice. Okie dokie. Craig, we're out of Mountain Dew. Okay, it's fine, we can get through this without it. So I found the difficulty to be quite an interesting subject. Usually it's there to provide a challenge, therefore make the game a little more entertaining by testing your skills. But occasionally it goes a little overboard. So I feel that it's time to separate the virgins from the epic gamers. I'll tell you straight up, I land in the latter. However, there is something I need to clear up. Just because I feel a boss is difficult doesn't necessarily mean that I dislike it. Trust me, difficulty can be done correctly. But on the other hand, it can be done poorly as well, so don't expect this to be entirely positive. So without further ado, all aboard the pain train! Sometimes when I really love a game, I like getting super dedicated to it and improving. Now, even though I'd love to do that with a lot more games, roguelikes never really hold my attention. I'm sorry, it's just after a while they become a little repetitive to me. But I see this as a very fitting opportunity to talk about Enter the Gungeon. With that title, it's pretty obvious that this is a bullet hell game. And the bosses certainly fit in well. So since I'm, admittedly, not that much of an epic gamer whenever it comes to this game, we're going to choose a boss on the lower end of the list. Issue is, I'm having a little bit of trouble picking between these two. Ooh! Oh, for the love of it! I decided to go with the Mind Flayer over the Ammoconda because I thought it'd be a little more interesting to talk about. The Ammoconda constantly puts pressure on you. With the Mind Flayer, on the other hand, it more so tries to get you into a terrible position. Most of the bosses shoot a large barrage of projectiles at you at once. The Mind Flayer goes a step beyond and has his projectiles reflect off the walls. I'd always find myself dodging the projectiles as they were coming towards me, but then my dodge roll would land me right into one that just reflected off the wall. He'll also throw out a lot of bombs at you. They're pretty easy to avoid, but once again, they put you into a terrible position if you get cornered. I will say, that's a lot more manageable than whenever he goes inside of his bell. He'll throw out a lot of other bells while hiding inside of one of them, and you have to find him. If you shoot a bell he's not inside of, however, it will explode and shoot a wave of projectiles at you. And as for the cherry on top, sometimes he'll shoot his waves of projectiles in odd patterns. I feel a little indifferent towards this boss. I don't enjoy fighting it, but it's not like I absolutely hate it. If there's one thing that is for certain though, it's probably the thing that ends most of my runs. A couple of months ago, my top 5 least favorite Kirby bosses video became one of my most popular videos, and I put the 3 mage sisters from Kirby Star Allies at number 5. A little while after that video was made, some free DLC was released with a new game mode, and at the very end of this game mode, you fight all 3 of the mage sisters at once. And a good handful of the comments asked me what I thought about that fight, and after so long, I think it's finally time for me to answer that question. Why do you care? Guys, this is not what I wanted. The Mage Sisters were way too easy. That was my issue. They had some cool ideas, but they never get to see the light of day because you kill them in 10 seconds. So how do you fix these 3 boss fights? Well, according to the developers, Elmer's glue. So instead of fighting 1 at a time, you'll fight 2 and occasionally one of them will tag out. So now instead of being incredibly easy, they have tons of coverage since it's, 2 characters on screen at once. And remember their special attacks, the one thing that they had going for them? Imagine 2 of those going off at once. I guess it does make them harder, but I feel like it's a cheap way to raise the difficulty. I must admit though, it is kinda funny whenever there's multiple special attacks on the screen at once. Funnily enough, nothing I've mentioned up to this point is what's so difficult about the boss to me. My issue is what is going on? There are 7 characters on the screen at once that it's so hard to pay attention to where you are. I'm sorry, but this isn't how you fix a flawed boss. However, there is one major upside to all of this. You get to see a lot more of their creative attacks since they have a lot more health. And you know, in some regard, I guess that still is a step up. I look forward to future countdown projects cause I have a feeling Cuphead will be making it onto a lot of different boss countdowns. I just hope I don't whittle down my choices too much. For example, I was going to talk about King Dice, but I literally talked about him in the last countdown. There's also Cala Maria, but trust me, we can guarantee that she gets a spot on a certain other list. So, oh, what the heck. I feel like out of every single boss in the game, Grim Matchstick was the 3rd hardest for me. He's a lot more different compared to the other bosses, mainly because of floating platforms. But phase 1 is no big deal after a little while. It takes some time to learn about his fireball patterns as well as his stupid tail, but you can get past that real easily. But then the next phase comes around where he goes to the other side of the screen and starts spitting out fireballs across his tongue. This is significantly more difficult since it's harder to hit him this way, and the fireballs take way longer to learn. The fireballs are supposed to lock onto you and then jump towards you, however sometimes I swear to get into a position where they try and predict where you go. Then there's the last phase where he grows 2 more heads and starts spitting out these other fireballs. They come out pretty frequently, travel across the screen somewhat fast, and on top of all of that, they explode into other fireballs if you hit them. Can you see the pattern? He seems to have a really hard to avoid projectile after the first phase for every following phase. And the projectiles in this phase practically make the chaser and spread shot unusable. And I don't see anyone complain about this, but the fireballs appear to spawn on a completely different layer of the screen. This, on top of periodically jumping from cloud to cloud, made this boss extremely difficult for me. Probably took my brother and I a whole hour to beat him. However, this is a good example of a hard boss I like. Even though the initial fight with this boss was super hard, I actually had a lot of fun all the way through. That still begs one important question, since a lot of people tend to hate this boss. Do I still think that this boss is difficult? What, do you think I'm some kind of virgin? I don't find him nearly as hard anymore. I'm pretty sure we've made it clear by this point. I am a gamer! But he's still a fun boss who puts up a good challenge. Doc, what I experienced on that day traumatized me forever. Can you help me? So, as you could probably tell, I'm not a very organized Pikmin captain. This is my first game after all, so you might have to cut me a little bit of slack. But I feel like the Plasm Wraith goes really overboard. As if stalking you throughout the formidable oak wasn't bad enough, it comes out for one last stand outside of it. And the Plasm Wraith itself is quite a different boss, sporting a unique health bar. Now of course, since this is a yellow walking Play-Doh monster, you're going to want to start throwing your Pikmin at it. Whenever you get enough hits on the Wraith, it'll ring itself squeezing out this yellow liquid. And even though the HP might deplete a little bit, it's not actually gone. You have to destroy the little chunks. If you don't, then it will suck all of them back up, regaining health. It's not too threatening at first, since all it can do is stab the Pikmin and then eat them. However, as you do more damage, it will start going to more drastic measures, such as making elemental barriers. And these traps make the fight a lot more messy. You can only destroy these with a Pikmin of a certain element. All others will get hurt by it. For most of these, you can just whistle your Pikmin and they'll be fine, but you'll sometimes walk through some of them, and the Pikmin, they're kinda stupid anyway. And even then, once they inevitably get hit, they're going to scatter around all over the place, making everything so cluttered. The fight starts simple and organized, but as it continues on, it clearly begins to unfold. And don't get me started on the last phase where he spits out 3 at once. But don't, oh, for crying out loud. So as if it wasn't a mess before, Now we're going to need to hire a janitor, and I don't have the funds to do so! And might I mention, at the end of the fight, destroying the traps is pretty much the only way to do any actual damage. Overall, I think this boss is a perfect choice for this list. In fact, he might be more challenging than some of the later bosses. But Luggo, if he's harder than some of the other bosses, why is he only number 7? Well, I can finally use my rock collection for something! No one's going to agree with this one. Remember what I said earlier about a hard boss not necessarily being bad? Well, this is the perfect example. But Luggo, red is harder! Whoa, buddy, that's very cool and informative. Oh, really? No! Yes, I am very much aware that there are harder Pokemon bosses in this. Some could be considered harder than Jetsis. But personally, I think Jetsis is the best hard boss of them all. He sports an intimidation factor that cannot be compared to literally everyone else on this list. The music is chilling, and Jetsis himself is such a crazy megalomaniac. And the intimidation doesn't stop there, cause his team is legitimately terrifying. He has heavy hitters such as Bisharp and Bouffalant who can swipe down your Pokemon in a single hit, his Cofagrigus, which is a major hindrance, as well as his Electros, which has no weakness whatsoever. But for all of you who've played the game, you know exactly where I'm going next. His Hydreigon, one of the most powerful Pokemon in the region with a dragon typing and several strong attacks. Without a doubt, one of the most threatening Pokemon to be given to a trainer in the main game. The difficulty of this fight really wraps everything together into an amazing package. And yes, I decided to choose his black and white battle over black 2 and white 2. Why? Because he replaces 2 of his fantastic team members with a not-so-threatening Drapion and an easy-to-take-care of Toxicroak. I don't think there will be anything that will ever compare to the original fight with him. I do have one major issue, though. He's using a Game Shark. Compared to most games, especially other 3D platformers, Yooka-Laylee's bosses tend to take a different approach. Most of the bosses I see here are a lot more difficult than in other platformers. This produces some mixed results. On one hand, it makes certain bosses really satisfying to beat, but on the other hand, it makes some of them tedious. And out of all of them, I don't see the reception being any more mixed than this. I was really excited to see what they would throw out for this final battle. And to be honest, I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with this boss. Like I said, it is a bit mixed. But let's get to the battle itself. Phase 1 starts with Capital B throwing bees at you, and you have to avoid them and then attack them after they're done attacking. Pretty basic, all things considered. In the second phase, Capital B brings in some henchmen as well as some ice flowers. You have to spit out ice pellets at him while he's hovering in the air, while also being chased by his henchmen. And in the next phase, his assistant Dr. Quack accidentally opens up the roof. These next few phases are a little similar to each other. Capital B will jump into the air and try and squash you, and as the phases proceed on, he'll throw projectiles at you, including shockwaves and other bees. Now thankfully, even though you're outside, you're still safe because bees can't What the crap?!
According to all known laws of aviation, there is no way that a bee should be able to fly.
Okay, he's flying. He'll shoot stinger missiles at you and you have to fly and redirect them into him. Now it starts out fine, but then for the last hit, he actually outspeeds the missiles. So instead of just guiding the missile towards him, you also have to intercept his flight path. This last hit makes the fight a lot more stressful, and I can explain why now that we've gotten all the phases out of the way and I can go into more detail. This fight has a staggering number of phases, and if you die during any one of them, you start all over. On your first couple of runs, this just boils the fight down to trial and error. There's a lot of things that you have to be mindful of and know how to approach. I don't think you'll be beating this on your first try. It takes a while to learn how to deal with some of these attacks, and there's no way of healing throughout this entire fight, so you might end up starting over. One of the last few phases is really overwhelming with Capital B chasing you while there's shockwaves going on, you're being chased by bees as well. And there's no telling how much more difficult that last phase is if you didn't get enough power badges to extend your power meter. If you didn't get enough, your power meter will end up being pretty small, making the time to guide the missiles a little tight. But I can say, after learning this fight, it is a decent challenge. This next fight involves a character that I've talked about to great lengths before. Fire Emblem Echoes may be one of the worst games I've ever played in my life, but one huge upside was the story, especially the character Burcu. Now if you want to get some extended thoughts on him, just go to Top 10 Crazy Video Game Characters. But to make things quick, he is the best hateable character I've ever seen. He starts off really cocky and smug, but as you defeat him, he actually starts descending into madness. And also, the 2 levels he was in were the only ones I liked. I love insulting this game! But during the finale of the game, everything goes straight downhill for him. It gets to the point where he can no longer stand being inferior to all. At his most desperate moment, while also not having anything left to live for, he ends up sacrificing his loved one, Renea, to the corrupt god Duma. And in return, he ends up getting corrupted himself by pure Excuse me for 1 second. Ma'am, I'm going to need to write you up a ticket for looking stupid. And while I'm at it, I'm going to also write one up for you. Oh. As for the fight itself, Burcu gets a pretty sizable army out of nowhere, I guess. I don't know. The enemy team is composed mostly of sorcerers who can put up quite a fight, and there are some bulky generals blocking the path towards Burcu. If you're patient and are able to keep your spacing well, then this should be manageable. Now once you get all of them out of the way, then it's time to fight Burcu and Renea, who are not quite as manageable. There's this mechanic in this game called support, where you can get some stat boosts as well as some other stuff if you have 2 characters stand next to each other. They changed it up a little bit in Echoes, excuse me if I got that wrong. But the point is that this is usually something that only you can take advantage of. However, Burcu and Renea actually have passive supports, and it doesn't help that they're already really strong. Well, okay, let's just take our time and slowly oh wait, no, you can't do that, because every now and then more witches will be summoned, and on top of that, Burcu and Renea have passive healing. So your party was already heavily whittled down by this army here, as well as all their annoying techniques. But the final stretch of this fight demands a whole lot from you. So I'm sorry, but this is one of the bosses on the list that I actually dislike. There's just so many things that aren't just difficult, but downright annoying. Much like the rest of the game. The Bravely Default games can have some really difficult bosses, mainly due to how complex the battle system can get. There are a lot of bosses I could choose from, but I think I'm going to stick with the one that I had to retry the most. So meet Deroso, the wielder of the Vampire Asterisk. After spending literally like 12 years spouting lore, he challenges your group to a fight. And as you can tell by his ranking, he's holding on to that asterisk for a while. The Vampire class in Bravely Default has a lot of coverage since they can learn monster moves. So of course, this translates into Deroso's moveset. One move that he ends up using a lot drains BP from one of your party members. For some context, doing what's called a default will give you 1 BP, which allows you to do multiple turns in 1 turn. It's one of the things that makes this battle system really complex. So now imagine having one of your turns outright stolen from you. He doesn't actually use the BP to get multiple turns, instead other moves involve using up BP. And there's one move in particular that's fueled by this. Energy Burst. It hits all of your party members for heavy damage, but it's not too difficult to deal with. It's one of his easier attacks to deal with. Is that all you've got, Deroso? That doesn't sound good. This is the most problematic move in the entire fight because Bone Crush does more damage depending on how much HP you have left. And of course, that's problematic because of Energy Burst. And that's not the only move that has good chemistry with Bone Crush, because he's also got Graviga. This move reduces all of your party members' HP by a specific percent. So the best thing you can do throughout this whole fight is keep your defenses up high and always heal, because Bone Crush alone will completely wipe out your party if you don't take any precautionary actions. Also another thing, if you really want the Vampire Asterisk, take care of it now and not later. Because if battling him alone is already really difficult, imagine him paired up with other bosses. This fight takes a lot of planning, a lot of strategizing, and a lot of patience, but boy, the reward is so worth it. Yeah, I don't have any sort of fancy introduction or joke for this one. In terms of phases, Capital B and the number 1 pick on this list have much more phases than this one. However, dare I say, this is probably the longest boss. People like to debate on who's the hardest Mario and Luigi final boss, but for me, it's hands down Dreamy Bowser. I've personally found the final bosses in the first 2 games to be hard for only one reason each. Cacaletta's Soul for how hard it is to avoid her attacks, and Elder Princess Shroob for how long the fight can turn out. Dreamy Bowser, on the other hand, combines both of these. Not only is his health monstrous, but like the other final bosses in the series, you have to take out other limbs before you can actually do damage to him. You have to spend turns attacking his arms to deplete their energy so he won't block your attacks against his head. And in the meantime, he'll be throwing out the most difficult, hard-hitting attacks in this series. There's quite a few attacks to talk about, but we'd be here all day, so let's talk about these specific 3. First one I want to mention is whenever he summons a dreamy airship to chase one of the brothers. It requires you to pay attention to multiple things at a time. It's one of the less difficult ones to avoid, but still it takes quite a bit of concentration. Then there's his hammer attack where whenever he flips this coin, it'll decide which brother he's going to attack. The coin spins for an obnoxiously long time, and Bowser swings the hammer really quickly. And since he attacks so quickly, you're going to have to be perfect on your reaction time. This is a very stressful attack to deal with. But nothing is quite as bad as whenever he'll start chasing you while shooting 3 flamethrowers. Now under normal circumstances, this wouldn't be too hard to deal with. However, the 3DS actually chugs whenever this attack is being used. I don't like to make a huge deal out of frame rate drops, but whenever it's specifically hindering my timing, that's where I take issue. If I'm going to be hindered by a technical problem, then maybe they should have made this attack less graphically intensive on a console that clearly can't handle it. But it's not just strong attacks or the long length that make this boss so difficult, because on top of all that, he can go into the background and heal himself. That's right, every now and then Bowser goes into the background and summons a bunch of enemies that you have to defeat. Every turn that they're not defeated, he'll heal a substantial amount of health. So you have to beat these enemies really quick or else all your progress on this boss will be thrown away. And I'm not kidding whenever I say this. One time whenever I defeated all of the enemies, he summoned more and then went back into the background to start healing again. So it looks like we've got ourselves both a huge technical flaw and a huge design flaw. This is my least favorite boss on the list by far. It's long, difficult, and extremely tedious. And you know, maybe if they patched up some rough spots as well as gave him a little less health to make the boss drag out for less, maybe I wouldn't hate this boss as much. But I feel this is a good example to show how fragile difficulty can be. It can enhance your experience by making you play like an epic gamer. It can make some parts more entertaining because you have to play better and think more. Or just a few mistakes can make everything go completely wrong, and then result in one of the worst final bosses you've ever fought. Difficulty in video games tends to encompass a lot of different things. It may require learning a specific pattern or intensive strategizing, or they could just throw stuff all over the place. But for certain kinds of games, one specific thing stands out on top. Skill. Some of you may think I'm just spouting out random nonsense, and you'd be partially correct on that. The point I'm trying to make here though is that... Oh no. Splatoon 2 Octo expansion had its really hard moments, but I never thought it would ever have a boss I would consider one of the hardest things in general I've ever done in any video game. If you complete every level in this DLC, then you unlock a secret boss fight against Inner Agent 3. Now at first, this may just seem like a harder version of the fight that took place at the end of the final level. However, this time around, they let Satan program it. Now whenever you first go in, you know things are going to be terrible since her weapon outranges yours. Or at the very least, it feels like it. But while both of you are making sweet love to your ZR button, she'll start throwing out auto bombs to chase you. And while they're not too threatening, they can mess up your positioning and also are persistent throughout the entire fight. Also, Agent 3 has special weapons she can use that swap out every phase. So because of all this, most of the battlefield's going to be covered in her ink, slowing you down and making you more vulnerable to attacks. But let's go ahead and and see how the fight progresses. You have to somehow land enough hits on her so that she'll super jump back to the UFO and then come back to the battlefield. Every time she jumps back, she'll use a splashdown, which is a one-hit KO if you don't avoid it. Now in the next phase, she'll start using the bubble blower, which can be blown up by the auto bombs as well as her, covering a lot of field. Now if you already love the auto bombs, then you're definitely going to love this phase because she gets an auto bomb launcher. So on top of constantly being shot at, you have to circle around the Savina while being chased by a handful of auto bombs. Now these first couple of phases can be ended quickly if your balls are bigger than the moon, because that would require you to charge directly at her and not miss a single shot, or else you'll probably die in the process. So usually these phases can be prolonged because you have to look for a perfect opportunity to get enough shots in. Oh, and due to how Splatoon's mechanics work, you regain health over time, and that also applies to Agent 3. So sure, each phase doesn't have that much health, but you have to get in enough shots or else it won't really count for anything. Now anyways, I say all of this cause no matter what, phase 4 is going to take the longest. She'll start flying around on the saucer, which means you can't get any good hits on her since she's too high up. Thankfully, her shots are really inaccurate in this phase, making it probably the easiest one out of the bunch. But it's still really stressful now that there's Tinta missiles in the mix and the auto bombs are still here. Also, since your shots don't reach the top of the saucer, you have to throw bombs instead. And they don't give you a lot of time to get in a precise bomb toss. Then there's the final stretch. All you have to do is just get a few more hits, and you actually no, screw you. They just couldn't end this fight on a happy note. For this last phase, she goes crazy with Splashdown. Reminder, if you get a little too close to this, then you're dead. And something I haven't brought up yet. If you die at any point during this fight, you have to start all over. Now this probably takes about 5 minutes in total, but after dying over and over and over again, it can easily add up to several hours. I don't know how many hours this took me, but I do know that I spent 3 days on this. But perfecting my timing and diving in for the last few hits and finishing her off was one of the most satisfying things I've ever done. And pushing me to my absolute epic gamer limit. I think that's enough to get number 1. I'm Luggo the Luggician, and I wear this toothpick with pride. See you all next time, gamers.